Yeah, my name is Paul Hundal. I've been a director with SPEC for the last 20 years. I've recently retired from SPEC, but I've had a long-term involvement with them in various issues involving protecting water quality in Greater Vancouver and now focusing on air quality. The problem with burning is that you're burning all sorts of plastics and organics, a wide variety of materials, which when they're burned together, they create an unpredictable combination of chemical compounds. Basically, you get the whole mix of everything. In fact, so many chemical compounds, chemical combinations are being created that scientists couldn't even predict what type of chemicals are coming out of there. And nanoparticles are so fine you can't even test for them. But what they do know comes out of there, and they admit, are dioxins, which at almost any level are known to cause cancer. As well, there's mercury, there's heavy metals like cadmium, and all these compounds, which they're known to come out, are also mixed with compounds which are basically unknowns. It's just the chemical cocktail that is the result of burning. The main concern I have about the waste management plan is there's certain key information that I feel is highly misleading that has been presented by Metro Vancouver with regard to the waste management plan. One of the facts which they're relying on is it's over the discussion about nanoparticles. Nanoparticles are very fine particles which are a concern because they're easy to breathe in, they're respirable. In other words, they get past your lung defenses and they get it into your lungs and into your bloodstream from there. Now, nanoparticles have been identified as a concern from burning, and the GVRD response was to say there's less nanoparticles coming out of the smokestack than there is in the ambient air. In other words, the air outside. The concern is that they're comparing apples and oranges. The nanoparticles that are ambient in the air, for the most part, are pollen, fine dust that we've long adapted to, that we've breathed in for centuries and our body has adapted to. The nanoparticles coming out of the smokestack are those chemical dust particles that have escaped the smoke filters. Now, so that means those nanoparticles are really a concentration of what are probably the most toxic materials you'll see in the air. So for them to say, well, there's less nanoparticles coming out of the stack than are outside, well, the chemicals in the air outside are natural for the most part and are not harmful. The nanoparticles coming out of the smokestack are about the most toxic combination you can get because it's made from a combustion of the widest variety of chemical compounds one can imagine putting together. The problem then is that everyone in the Greater Vancouver region is exposed to it and will breathe it in small amounts. And that gets us back to another statistic which the GVRD gave, which I thought was very misleading. Metro Vancouver in the report said the reason they support the waste energy incinerators is because they will reduce net emissions. In other words, that if they generate energy from the burning, then people in houses who use that energy won't have to burn natural gas, and therefore they'll burn less natural gas, and therefore that will offset the emissions created by burning. So they're saying that they'll end up with less net emissions. And so based on that environmental assumption, that impact that they assume, they're saying that when they do the comparison of landfilling versus burning, burning has the least impact. That is the best approach for the environment. But they're making an apples and orange comparison again. In other words, you reduce natural gas burning by 100 tons and you increase the garbage burning by 80 tons, so you end up with 20 tons less emissions. That's how they come up with it. But what they're comparing is natural gas emissions with garbage incineration emissions. So yeah, we're going to have 80 tons more emissions from burning garbage. Well, that is far more toxic. That's one of the most toxic forms of emissions you're going to get. but you're going to get a reduction of 100 tons of natural gas emissions, which they say is the benefit. Well, natural gas emissions are one of the cleanest emissions that you get. You're burning natural gas and you end up with a fairly benign output as far as emissions relative to oil, relative to diesel, relative to coal. I mean, comparing fuels, natural gas emissions are about the cleanest. So if you have less natural gas emissions, but you replace them with highly toxic garbage emissions, you're not better off. You're worse off, because you may have taken away 100 tons of clean emissions, but you've replaced them with 80 tons of what are probably the dirtiest, most unhealthy emissions that we create in this city, or we will create in this city. So we're not better off. They're comparing apples and oranges and treating them the same, but they're not the same. So there is not a net reduction in environmental impacts. There's actually a substantial increase in environmental impacts, especially to human health. And that's why I think this plan is so wrong, and that the public is being misled on the environmental impacts of waste incineration.